So we talked about what was going on in China. So during that timeline now, what is going on with the other countries of Asia? There's no doubt that as China was building up its empire more and more and more, it's affecting other nations as well. So this is in Widowson's book, page 113. This is very interesting. Japanese origins are lost like many others. A primitive strain of Japheth, that's Caucasian, entered the islands, and they were followed by a Shemitic strain coming from Korea. So that's how they go over there. He also mentions the Mongol strain coming in from the north was added to a darker Malay or Indonesian group from the south. This unique mixture resulted in a unique culture, language, and appearance. So concentrating from where we move on to China, what about the rest of Asia that was affected? So you'll notice that there's an influence from Korea over here. So an influence from Korea that affected Japan. Now, if you recall what I talked to you about Korea from this migration over here, right? From this migration, I mentioned that they were going through Siberia. As they were going through Siberia, then they entered actually Mongolia. So the site that I will source is just my doctorate paper. That's it. So that's all I'll say. You'll just have to take my word for it. If you guys doubt what I say, the best thing is you to research yourselves. So any of the terms I give to you, research it and it will be very enlightening. So then, when I compared the data charts, genetic data charts within 10 different universities and 2 or 3 gene bank science organizations, there's a good strain of genetics that goes from the Tower of Babel through Siberia. Remember, they were carrying shamanism, and that affected Native America over here, right? But before they entered Native America over here, they were going through Siberia to Mongolia to Korea. That's why Widowson says that the Mongols, they were able to affect this part during the South. So there was like a Mongol strain that's affecting toward a southern region over here. As the Mongol strain was affecting the Malay and Indonesian group, as we continue on with our teachings, he also mentions there was a Caucasian strain. Now remember, they came from Siberia, okay? From Siberia to Mongolia to Korea, and then from Korea to Japan, okay? That's how it goes. If they came from Siberia, that would explain a Japhetic strain, Caucasian strain that came. Widowson says there was a few Caucasians that did enter the Japanese islands. But then, now it's been overtaken by a Semitic strain. Then, this Caucasian strain, what happened? We'll come back to them a little later on. But this migration is pretty interesting over here. So then, we see that in Korea, the history goes is that, remember, it's the Han Dynasty. We entered that timeline. Remember that? After the Great Wall of China, now enter the Han Dynasty. Han Dynasty is important because that is during the timeline of Christ and the early Christians that we'll later cover on. But the Han Dynasty pretty much took over the Korean nation. So when you look back in Korean history, it is part of the Han kingdoms that time. That's what happened to Korea. Korea's history, they claim that they started out with intermingling, obviously, with a bear and then some kind of deity. There's always a bestiality for them. Bestiality, sons of God. Genesis 6 is the origin, again, of nearly any pagan nation that you hear, or any birth of a nation is Genesis 6. So then that's how Korea started out with. Then they had these kings that would reign for centuries, if not 1,000 years. That's the same thing with Korea. Very similar with China. Then after that, then we come to a Yemek tribe over here. The Yemek tribe over here. And then there was a debate whether the Yemek tribe or the Chinese nations, that they were conglomerated with Korea when Korea was born, or Korea independently made its own laws. So they were wondering if China had an influence on the legal code system of Korea, or if Korea independently made it themselves. So that's the origins of Korea. But then they influenced the strain into Japan later on. So then with Japan, the Chinese people on page 114, same book, dismissed the Japanese as dwarf people in the 4th century. Now, this is according to H. Gowen's Outline History of Japan. So this is Gowen's work. So Gowen, he says it this way concerning about the Japanese people. And this is what we read over here. They have neither oxen nor wild beasts. They tattoo their faces in pattern varying with their rank. They wear garments woven in one piece. They have spears, bow, and arrows tipped with stone or iron. They wear no shoes, are law-abiding and polygamous, so having multiple wives. Addicted to strong drink and long-lived. The women smear their bodies with pink and scarlet paint. There is no theft and litigation is infrequent. So we see over here that there is a contrast of what the Chinese see as dwarf people, as people who are unsophisticated, with today's Japan. What a huge change over here. So during that time, it was primitive to the Chinese people, but then Japan quickly became powerful, especially during World War II, that we see later on. So there was a huge change over there. The Yayoi culture in Japan was around 300 BC. They introduced rice farming according to some sources. So it started out with, a little bit of civilization, rice farming. Then the Kofun period, it marked the rise of strong military clans. So now they start to build up their warfare as we hit to the Kofun period that time. Now this is the interesting thing about Japanese birth. We saw Korean birth. It has to be an intermingling of a god. Guess what with Japan? You think they intermingled with the god? You think they started their story that way too? Yes, nearly every country claims that. So this is very, very telling concerning about after the Noah's flood, that there were survivors from the sons of God, as I've told you so many times. According to Japanese mythology, the 3,000 island culture was founded by the Emperor Jimmu in the 7th century BC, a descendant of the god Amaterasu, daughter of Izanagi. Why is this important about Amaterasu over here? You notice this arrow? It comes from someplace, this religion. Can you guess? It's not just Genesis 6 civilization they carry. What else they carry in their religion system? Do you all remember? So let's keep reading. She became the ruler of the high celestial plane called Takamagahara, while commonly thought of as female. Other Japanese works, such as the Hotsuma Sute, regard her as a he. Wait a minute. Did you all remember a long time ago discipleship classes? A female deity, but it's interchangeable with the he form. That's Satan. Satan changing from he to she. The human who carried it, you all know who she was. Let's keep reading. I refer you to the ancient Near Eastern concept of a he-she goddess, who is, as Madame Blavatsky would have it put, the same god, Lucifer. The Celestial Virgin, and I read you her work on that one a long, long time ago in discipleship class, if you attended that one. So here's an interesting quote from a website called The Divine Feminine. The Divine Feminine. From Amaterasu and Kannon in Japan, to Kuan Yin in China, to Tara in Tibet, to Shakti in India, to Aquaba in Africa, to Isis in Egypt, to Ishtar and Astarte in the Middle East, to Demeter, Aphrodite, and Venus in Greece and Rome, to the great goddess of Willendorf and Lausel, to Freya in Scandinavia, to Spider-Woman and Ixchel the Weaver in North America. The Divine Mother has a long tradition in the history of the planet's consciousness. Semiramis, right here, right? All the way from the Tower of Babel. They all share something in common over here. Now, let's cover the Americas over here. Remember, these people, what happened to this Caucasian strain? Here's something interesting. Remember, they were traveling through here, right? As they crossed the land bridge over there. But here's something interesting. But let's go one at a time. Let's talk about Peru from 850 to 300 BC. That's the Shavan period. Remember, I talked to you about the Shavans a long time ago. So he mentions over here, it is also known as the Middle Formative Period, and it is characterized by its pottery, which still has its effects seen today in pottery of indigenous cultures around the area. This culture, according to archaeologists, mysteriously disappeared, which means they can't find evidence that fits their theories. And from this perspective, nothing much of significance happened for another 500 years. So this is a mysterious culture, this Shavan period. This period represents the earliest culture in Peru and shows the beginnings of basket weaving, textiles, and other industry that shows that people were doing things other than merely trying to survive from day to day. The Andes Mountains are the primary geological feature of Peru, and the Andean terrain is a very difficult one in which to survive. The next significant period in Peru's history doesn't start until about 100 AD. So as you can tell, there's not much information about the Shavan culture in Peru, around South America. There's a missing time period. All we know is that they had some primitive beginnings of a civilization, pottery, basket weaving, etc. But let's get to some interesting things. What about North America during the BCs? They mention over here is the Adena culture in Ohio, okay, the state of Ohio, where it's at, the Adena culture from 500 to 100 BC. They lived in villages and by hunting and gathering as well as fishing. Adena artifacts have been found from New York to Pennsylvania to southern Illinois. Now I'm on page 115 of same text. Their mounds started out as simple burial sites, but were probably used for other religious purposes as well, as most of the common people appear to have been cremated. One of the most interesting things about the Adena people was their unusually large size and strong or robust frames. All of them, men and women, appear to have been over 6 feet tall, which is very strange for that time. Well, that's not strange to us. Remember, I told you 2 common things. A religious system that's Babylonian, Nimrod, Semiramis. But the other one is what kind of technology and civilization? What kind of remnant? Genesis 6. Because remember, the survivors of the sons of God bloodlines. So if you remember that thought in your Bible, in our long time ago discipleship classes on history, then this would make perfect sense on why it's not a surprise to us why they were unusually tall-sized people during that time. You want to hear another interesting thing? The most famous of the mounds that the Adena culture had is the Great Serpent Mound, featuring a serpent swallowing a round object like the sun, which archaeologists tell us was related to one of their myths. It shows a rebellion over here of, let's say it was a son of God who started his culture over here in America, and then he raised up this and then his teaching would be where the Son of Righteousness, Jesus Christ, is overpowered by a satanic figure. And the people built up an idol like that later on. Would that be interesting? Now, there are many people who contend that travelers, how they entered the Americas is this. From the old world, or otherwise known as, we've heard about Shem, right? Remember I taught you a long time ago? Those Semites, which carried shamanism, went from all the way here, Korea, Japan, and then they went down over here, which is why the Native Americans carried shamanism. But it's not just Semites. It's also from Europe. And not just Europe. He also says Africa and the Near East. Why? Why all of a sudden them? Because it's not just walking over here, a migration. Do you remember a long time ago how else they migrated to the Americas? If y'all remember, it was through boats. Josephus, I read you a quote from Josephus about that. So that's the reason why that they could have entered the Americas over here. So remember that Caucasian strain in Japan? Here's another thing. If they were carrying on from Siberia, they may have walked through over here too, not just traveling by ship. Interesting. The problem with scholars who do not accept the Bible narrative is that they cannot understand how cultures around the world can be so different and yet have such fundamental similarities, because they can't see the common origin of human society in the pre-flood culture passed on through Noah's sons. In any event, here's something interesting. The oldest human remains found in North America, called Kennewick Man, dated by conventional scholars at 9,000 BC. What do you think the oldest fossil that they would find, or the oldest human remain? I would like to ask you this question. What do you think, what nationality would it be? Ham, Shem, or Japheth? Probably the common thinking would be Shem, right? Because they're migrating over there. That's historically proven. Actually, it's Caucasian.
Shut up.
Caucasian. Japheth. Wow. That's it. Is Caucasian not a Mary Indian? Not the Native American culture. That's how far back this Caucasian strain, see, went from the islands of Japan and entered over here. That means it's a really long time ago. Wow. How about that? All right, so well, YouTube's going to ban this video now just for saying that. Yeah. All right, but anyway, now this is, now that we talked about the interesting migration, this is even more interesting. The Olmecs. Remember I talked to you about them? That they were a culture that had statues of colossal deformed heads around Central America, where Mexico could be also involved with. Do you all remember about that? Well, the Olmecs, he says, of the East Mexican lowlands in Central America, their culture lasted from 1300 BC to 400 BC. And they were known as the mother of all cultures during that time. So they were the mother of all the cultures within that region. That's why the Olmecs is an important group of people and civilization that you want to know. Mother of Middle American cultures. Remember that. So why are they so important? As you might recall, they were known for leaving behind statues of colossal deformed heads. Huge heads. What if they were survivors of the sons of God? Right that? What about that, huh? The giants, the remnants, the lineage, the seed of the sons of God. Some researchers say they came from Asia and some from Africa. It is likely they were part of that slow migration from the ancient Near East through Western Asia to Eastern Asia, right? Remember this? And across what was thought to be the land bridge that is now the Bering Straits, separating Alaska from Eastern Asia. So then it came down through this way. But it is also possible that they came by sea from across the Atlantic. No surprise. Now, the reason why they are very interesting people is that this culture came to be as a combination from this older culture, which is why the Olmecs are important. The Mayans. Heard about the Mayan calendar, for example, about the end of the world? How about that? Well, let's keep reading over here. They had an advanced calendar, the Olmecs. They're talking about the Olmecs before the Mayans came out. An advanced calendar, and their writing is similar to that of certain West African tribes. When Mayan hieroglyphs were examined, it was found that they resembled North African and Near Eastern glyphs. So something went on over here. So they may have been a migration to over here. How could they have migrated? Well, maybe they went through ship, or if they did carry that calendar system, some of those sons of God, their remnants, they could fly, or they could swim from the intermingling result of Genesis 6. You ever thought about that? Hey, all right, well, let's keep reading. The Mayan culture lasted from 500 BC to around 1200 AD, scholars tell us. Now, we're going to come back to the Mayans later on to the time of Christ. So they built some interesting sites. All right, let's just say very interesting. But we will, instead of their sites, let's talk about their calendar. So that covered the BC's timeline, that's why. You got to realize during the time when Jesus Christ was about to be born, that's when the Mayan civilization, a satanic influence was building up. That was trying to already imitate Christianity or compete with it. I don't know what Satan was thinking or what those sons of gods were thinking. But it was during a timeline when Jesus Christ was about to be born, the Mayans came out. But let's keep reading. The Mayans are in the news today because of the great tragedy of many of their villages becoming mass graves due to the impact of Hurricane Stan in 2005. These people have had a long and tragic history, carving out an advanced civilization in the jungles of Central America, and then mining into the poor and often remote subsistence farmers we know today. They are also famous for their advanced calendar consisting of cycles that end mysteriously. Do you all know when they end mysteriously? They even made a movie on this. Yeah, 2012. 2012. That was supposedly the date of the end of the world. But now, okay, there are people, remember the calendar systems could be off. Because calendar date setters realize that fact, there are scholars and researchers that keep putting the end of the world date from the Mayan calendar at a later and later date. Some of them would put on the 2020s, for example. I've heard about that. Or the late 2010s. So, I mean, remember, I taught to you this. In the biblical calendar, the year 2000 should have been the time when the end of the world happened and God's new millennial kingdom should have been set up. So then those Mayans, the devil may not have, perhaps the devil doesn't know the exact timing when the Lord might set things up, but that devil knows that Bible. And don't you think that he knows it more than you guys do? And he found a time system in the Word of God, and then he was teaching his culture something. Especially during a time when it was during the time of Jesus Christ, when he was supposed to set up his messianic kingdom, but was rejected by the Jews. But the Mayans built their kingdom. A lot of interesting stuff over there, these people. This is found at page 158. The Mayan used hieroglyphic writing with over 500 signs, 300 of which have been thought to have been deciphered by now. They had a sophisticated calendar with 3114 BC being the date for the creation of the world. Now, isn't that interesting? They don't go back like the evolutionists, like millions and millions of years. These pagans had something more advanced than these stupid scientists today. Even what's funny about the 2012 Hollywood movie, they would say those primitive Mayans, they were way ahead of us scientists with our advanced technology machines. Whoa. Whoa. We believe that it was around 4000 BC, right? That's the creation. The devil, he's getting close to biblical than some lost liberals. Because he knows that book. Converting this highly sophisticated calendar into Christian chronology was a key task for early scientists. This correlation is and has been done using astronomical observations. That's why it's important, because our Christian chronology, all of the time system today, as scholars want to hide the Christian terms BC and AD, because those are Christian terms, this is where our calendar is built upon. But then what they do is that they compare our calendars, or the Christian calendars, with the Mayans. That's how important the Mayan source calendars are. That's Satan's wisdom right there. He was wiser than Daniel, as the Bible would say. Okay, now, let's go to, now that we covered the Americas over here, let's cover other parts. Let's cover South Asia here. Here's some interesting points here. 599 to 527 BC, we have a person named Mahavira. And when he was born, he came from, remember, Hinduism. I talked to you some parts of Hinduism during ancient India civilization, okay? They had some forms of Hinduism and beliefs forming that time. So it's as ancient as BC's. But these religions became broken parts from Hinduism, which became common religions today. One of them, Mahavira, he founded the religion known as Jainism. All right. Right there. His parents believed that the rebirth of Hinduism was a curse, and the religious sect they belonged to valued suicide. When Mahavira reached the age of 31, his parents did just that by starving themselves to death. Distraught over his parents' suicide, he renounced the world and wandered for 13 years, finally being declared a Jina or conqueror by his disciples who followed him. Now wait a minute. In his age of 30s, he's frustrated with the system, and he lives a secluded life and has followers proclaiming he's a conqueror. Right before who was born? Jesus Christ was born, who was in his 30s, who disciples thought he was conquering the world, and he lived a secluded life. He had no place to lay down or home to lay down, and he was always outdoors. Satan was probably thinking and seeing somebody's coming. So I'm going to raise up my Messiah, so to speak. So that's why today it's so successful. People don't see a difference with Jesus, Buddha, and the Mahavira, and etc. Wow. The Jina, so this teaching according to, so then he was declared to be a Jina or conqueror. That's what they called. A Jina is known also to be as a conqueror by Mahavira's disciple. The Jina is what? Like Alice Bailey's New Age doctrine, the coming one, was someone who regularly came throughout history to enlighten the world in some way, kind of like Jesus. Mahavira's followers called themselves Jains, and before he died at the age of 72, they had created a celibate clergy and an order of nuns. And they don't see the difference with Jesus's Christianity with Roman Catholicism, with their clergy of priests and nuns. The world don't see a difference. Wow. See what Satan did? Yeah. Wow. Satan was doing some, the Maya culture and then his messiahs. Jainism started out logically, according to modern thought, that there is no absolute truth, in that all truth is relative to someone's opinion. What is true to me might not be true to you. Absolute truth only came to those rare Jinas who came to teach mankind. So they went on to deny the existence of God because it was just as hard for them to accept a creator without a beginning as it was for them to accept that things never had a beginning. They believed in the eternal pre-existence of the universe, much like the Greek Aristotle and many modern scientists who look to the Big Bang singularity as being eternal. But it wasn't long before the Jains, after emptying heaven of God, began to people it with deified saints of Jain legend. So that's how they claim the creation goes. These were worshipped as gods with great devotion and ceremony. They even believed that stone and metal had souls. If one achieved a sinless life, he or she became a supreme soul and was spared reincarnation. In other words, like many other man-made and Satan-inspired religions and science, they simply made it up as they went along. I like this author. And this is what he said at page 116, on page 116 of his work. The road to this supreme state of being was by complete ahimsa, or it's also otherwise known as abstinence from injury to any living thing, even an insect. Suicide, though, is approved of as the only killing permitted is the killing of oneself. Eventually, they split into different sects with varying beliefs. But in a land where life can be so hard and so short, they always had a following. Always had a following. So we get that over here, moving to India. India was a dark land. I told you a lot of the bad things about Hinduism, Jainism. Now let's come to this one. 563 to 483 BC, we see a guy named Gautama. He was also known as Buddha. All right, so we see over here that Buddha over here, he is similar with the Mahavira. As a Messiah figure, discontent of the religious system or the empire of that time, lived a secluded life and had his own followers. You see how you can't tell Jesus from Buddha and Mahavira unless you have that book. Unless you really have a open-minded thinking and critical thinking at the same time, and you research. You're not lazy about it. The religion named after him has found a great many adherents in the Far East, but also a great many followers in the West, particularly since the late 1800s. Buddha was born into a wealthy family, was married, and was living a happy, prosperous life when he saw suffering, and it had a great effect on him. He realized that traditional Hindu philosophy didn't answer the questions these scenes of sickness and poverty laid on him. So he began to pursue an introspective search for truth. He left his wife and newborn son and became an ascetic one who renounces possessions and comfort, living in the desert. Kind of like Jesus in Matthew 19 to a rich young ruler. Forsake all your riches, give it to the poor, and follow me. Can't tell the difference. Satan was raising confusion after confusion. Now, this is sad. He left his wife and newborn son, which I already read. When he leaves, legend tells us that Mara, prince of evil, tries to tempt him, but he refused and rode on, not looking back. Why? Kind of like Jesus, tempted by Satan at the wilderness. You can't tell the difference. Eventually, Buddha reached a state of enlightenment, according to that religion's traditions, after sitting for a long time under the Bodhi tree. He came to the conclusion that birth is the beginning of all evil. Wow, isn't that amazing? He caught enlightenment sitting under a tree. Can you believe that? Jesus died on the tree so that we can receive a born-again enlightenment life. This guy sat underneath the tree. You see what Satan's doing? He's trying to imitate Jesus. The devil's seeing some things. He came to the conclusion that birth is the beginning of all evil, and that if a man could live a life of perfect justice, unvarying patience, and kindness to all, he could avoid being reborn. The ultimate goal of Buddhism is nirvana, where all cravings and desires have ended, and the mind and soul have merged with unconscious infinity, losing all personality and self-awareness. This God-denying and Bible-rejecting religion is believed in a sort of hybrid way with many pagan beliefs in the modern New Age movement. You notice this New Age movement with Semiramis he-she God, New Age movement with Jainism, New Age movement with Buddhism. This is all New Age stuff where it comes to a new world order, a new world age one day. All right. Now, let's talk about Alexander the Great. Why is he important within this South Asia region? Because when he was conquering, he reached South Asia. So this is interesting. Alexander the Great of Macedon, the Greek general, conquered Persia, entering India in 327 BC. All right, so here we go. What does he do when he reaches over here at 327? This is according to Durant's dating. Early in 326 BC, he crossed the Indus River and began a 3-year campaign that resulted in his claiming Western India as a tributary of Macedon. Among other things, he brought knowledge of a Greek combat sport called pankration, or all powers, similar to the brutal combat sports one can see on television today. So basically, martial arts. All of martial arts. No wonder Alexander the Great, he was a fighter. How about that? Martial arts come from a guy like that. This became the Indian fighting arts of Kalaripayat and Vraj Mushti, which were later taken into China by the monk Daruma. So it came from there to China by this monk Daruma, and that became Kung Fu and other Shaolin arts. Then it finally reached to Japan by way of Okinawa, and Japan it became known as, can you guess? Karate. How about that? All from Alexander the Great, a type of the Antichrist. Wow. Interesting stuff. Now let's go, now what happened? Alexander the Great, he conquered India, and India, what did it do? It didn't take too long, actually, because Alexander's life was short-lived, his kingdom. It only took about 7 years for Macedonian authority to be removed from India by the great Indian ruler Chandragupta. He was a young noble, so we see that over here, right? So look at these 3 time periods here. He was a young noble of the Kshatriya, or warrior clan. Chandragupta organized a small army and overthrew the Macedonian garrison, that's the remnants of Alexander's kingdom, left to rule India, and freed the natives from the Greek bondage. So there was Greek influence in India, remember that. So then this is how it goes throughout different dynasties. The Mauryan dynasty, all right, he then conquered what was called Hindustan and Afghanistan, and that created the Mauryan dynasty. So that was by Chandragupta, and it ruled over a century. The successor to Chandragupta was Ashoka. He was known as the philosopher king. He ruled Afghanistan and all of India except for the very remote southern portion called Tamilakam, or Tamil land, beginning in 273 BC. He was a cruel ruler, and the Chinese related, because China knew about India. That's how far Ashoka's influence was. The Chinese related how a prison that Ashoka kept in northern India was still known even 900 years later as, some of you may have heard this term, Ashoka's hell. Eventually, he had a religious conversion, abandoned his cruelty, demolished his prison, and began to rule like some sage or philosopher, calling his citizens his children. Now we reach this so-called golden age of India, from the death of Ashoka until the Gupta dynasty. Okay, from Ashoka to the Gupta dynasty now, it was a golden age of India. It lasted about 600 years. And Persian and Greek influence, that was what it was known during the golden age of India. Why? Because Persia and Greeks' conquest and influence reached all the way up to here. So you'll see some of that. You'll see Greek and Persian influence in Indian art and architecture. Some other interesting things over here is that the Greeks and Syrians did conquer the area known as Punjab and established a Greco-Bactrian culture over there as well. So there was this back and forth with Greeks and the Syrians. And the Syrians will come to a little later. Hopefully I can squeeze that in the time. The Kushans, related to Turkish people, conquered what is now called Afghanistan. They're now called the Kushans. These Kushans had the greatest king named Kanishka. Now, it was a kingdom that produced magnificent architecture, which was a combination of Greek, which is no surprise, but another architecture and influence was Buddhist as well. So Buddhism was spreading. So Buddhism and Grecian influence was spreading during the architecture and arts throughout this time period of the golden age of India. the regions that were affected by the Gupta dynasty. Now, we come to Africa over here, all right? As we come to Africa over here, this is intensely interesting. If you look at Genesis chapter 10, the Bible shows over here one of the sons of Ham. His name was Cush, right? All right. Where we come to the country of Nubia, okay? Nubia, the interesting thing about this town is that it was it extended then from the Nile town of Elephantine southward to just above Khartoum, Sudan. Though much of history, it was dominated by Egypt. So Egypt was the one that dominated Nubia at that time. But when internal troubles kept Egypt within its borders, Nubia flourished. Modern people in southern Egypt and the Sudan still refer to themselves as Nubian and even speak Nubian. Why is Nubia so important? You might want to know this one, all right, out of all of today's lesson, all right? This is what's interesting about them. By 800 BC, Egypt had fragmented into rival states. In 747 BC, the city of Thebes in southern Egypt was threatened by northerners, and the Egyptians called upon the Nubian king for protection. So you see that the Nubians and Egyptians, they were interrelated a lot. Okay, they had connections with each other. The Kushite king Paye marched north from his capital at Napata, rescued Thebes, and reunified Egypt. For the next 100 years, Kushite kings ruled both Nubia and Egypt. So Egypt and Nubia is very intertwined. Why do you want to know that? This era was brought to a close by the invasion of Assyrian armies at 663 BC, and the Nubian king fled south to his capital at Napata. So remember, Assyria Empire during that time, they were conquering lands in Egypt as well. So the guy went to his capital in Napata, and Nubia, what did they do? Where Egypt was being conquered, what was going on with Nubia then? So let's keep reading. By 200 BC, the capital, Napata, had shifted yet farther south to Meroe, where the kings continued to be buried in what type of tombs? Pyramid tombs, because of Egyptian influence. So Egyptian influence was spreading in Nubia. They built temples to Nubian and Egyptian gods in a hybrid Egyptian Roman African style. The two countries that God condemned a lot was Rome and Egypt. They come from Africa. Whose seed that God condemned? Right here. Ham's seed, where the devil started to use his seed, his culture, his influence, etc. It was affecting not just the Old Testament time, but the New Testament time period. The Roman Catholic Church, a lot of their church fathers, the bad ones, came from right here, the African region. You're going to find out. Modern Bibles today, African region. Contemporary music today, we'll later find out, African region. That's interesting. That's why Ham is connected to Egypt and Rome. The guy who's in between, this is interesting. Meroe had existed as the capital of Cush since the 4th century, right here. According to Hislop, Cush was the father of Nimrod, as you might recall. Hey, how about that? Interesting stuff. Cush Nubia was one of the oldest, if not the oldest kingdom of the Nile River. You gotta understand. The only things that remain today are ruins of temples and many pyramids. No surprise there. No surprise. Sons of God activity. Satanic influence. All right, let me wrap this one up. Now we come to Ethiopia. We go from Egypt. We covered all the timeline over here up to Egypt, but we're wondering what goes beyond Egypt. We go to Nubia. Now let's keep going down, okay? Ethiopia. In the Ethiopian highlands bordering the Red Sea was the kingdom of Aksum from about 500 BC. This was a fabulously wealthy trading center for Africa, India, and the Near East. Historians believe that the Aksumites in the Ethiopian highlands were a mixture of Cushites, and because of the Nubian influence, as well as Arabians. Which is why in your Bible, okay, think about it. Slavery originated where? Right over here. Remember that? At the book, at Joseph. I showed you that in previous discipleship. Slavery came from the Arabians over here, which were remnants of who? Right here. This guy. All the time. All the time. Satan used his line over here. But then, from Ham's line, we see the Arabians with their slavery combined with the other Hamites over here at Ethiopia, Cushites, and that's where slavery was formed, which is why at Acts chapter 8, it was an Ethiopian eunuch who received the gospel and got saved. And if you look at Ethiopia, a lot of times you'll see slavery mentioned. You'll see slavery mentioned over there. And we see the Ethiopian eunuch. Eunuchs, Jesus mentioned about eunuchs during his time. Why? Well, this was a wealthy trading center, and Ethiopia was one of them. The Lord had plans for them. That's why he sent Philip down there, to give them the glorious light of the gospel of Christ. They were in darkness. Now, Widdowson says something interesting. It is most likely that the movement of people into the jungles of Africa, it was not all the way at the BCs, actually. It wasn't at the beginning. That was later. This was after this advanced civilization. The movement of people into the jungles of Africa was a slow process due to the diseases of such a hostile environment. So you see that? So it had to take a long time. So you got to realize kingdoms were flourishing in Africa. It wasn't a pagan primitive area. It was successful kingdoms, and then they retreated into the jungles, but they couldn't go immediately because it was such a hostile environment and diseases. So then the Lord, there must have been something here where the Lord definitely was not happy with the history of the kingdoms over here, and then the Lord had to force them out, so to speak, into the jungles. And then it had to take that much, where Africa is probably one of the best continents and countries where they receive the gospel now, during the Great Awakening revivals. But Africa, it's building up high civilizations now too. It's only a matter of time. They're just going to be as godless as America. Many legends in this sub-Saharan Africa region mention that King Solomon, he had mines in Central Africa, which is not a surprise. Why? Two passages is 1 Kings 10:22, and then the other one is Chronicles. Let's see over here. 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 21. 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 21. This is not a surprise if you read these two passages, because King Solomon, he had trades. He brought gold, apes, and peacocks within the African region. That's why. In northern Africa, we have many tribal peoples living along the shores of the Mediterranean. One of the most noteworthy are the Libyans, also called Cyrenians. Now, I have to stop here, which is too bad. So, I went over the time, so I got to stop. So I didn't cover here. This is going to be interesting. You know why? This is all based off of the book of Daniel. Daniel 11. This is the whole chapter here. So while all this was going on, the Messiah was about to be born. In order for the Messiah to come, this kingdom had to do something. God had to wait for these kingdoms to do something. We're going to see what happened after Alexander the Great died, what God had to set up. And this will include the Maccabees. Heavenly Father, I pray that tonight's teachings were a blessing to the hearers and that we understand how much the Bible, a lot of the action that took place is because a lot of historical things that took place and what Satan is doing to try to corrupt the Bible during history. Help us to be more aware of our past. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, your next ad lib commentary homework.